Welcome to Photoactive, a podcast about photography and technology. I'm Kirk McElhearn.
And I'm Jeff Carlson.
Good morning, Jeff. How are you today?
Doing very well as always, because we get to talk about cameras and photography.
We get to talk about cameras and photography, and we've got a guest this week. Second-time guest, Dan Bracaglia from DPReview. Dan was on, I think it was episode 54, talking about product photography. Dan, nice to have you back.
Thank you for having me. I'm very pleased to be here.
Dan is a film photography buff, and we wanted to talk about film cameras and shooting with film. And to me, having started photography with film cameras, it's really this like the exact equivalent of vinyls in music. It's like, why would I ever go back to vinyl with all the noise and the problems of discs getting warped and everything? And why would I want to go back to film where I have to actually pay to get those little things to put in the camera? Then I have to pay someone to put them through chemicals. Then I have to pay them again to print them. And what's the point?
Hang on. You're forgetting the whole problem with film photography is that whenever I've tried it, I can't get the preview to show up. Where's the little thing that shows me what I just took? How does this work?
It is a different mindset, isn't it?
It is.
It's definitely a different mindset. And I think that's exactly why people are starting to gravitate towards film, especially, some of the younger generation folks getting into photography. The immediacy of, your iPhone that takes a photo and you can click enhance and it looks great and you can post it, and that's kind of one and done. It's sort of the opposite end of that spectrum. It's the slow down, take your time, really think about it, get involved in the process sort of mentality. I think that's making people interested in it.
But this is what a lot of people say about vinyl, too, except the majority of people who buy vinyl records just put them on the wall and never play them. No, it's true. There are studies that show this. I buy some vinyl records just to support artists I like. They're sitting in a room upstairs waiting until I can flip them on eBay for twice what I paid.
I don't disagree with you there. But as someone who I have a record player that I inherited from my parents and a small but decent collection of vinyl. And most of it, none of it's on the wall, but there is something to be said when maybe you come home from a night out with a romantic partner. There's something to be said for going to the record player, putting a record on, hearing the sort of needle scratch a little bit, and sort of settling in. It's sort of those things out there that you can't really touch or feel or explain, but they make you feel good and fuzzy.
Want to come upstairs and listen to my vinyl?
I think that used to work for many, 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 many years.
Yeah. So let's be honest. If you're of that age group where vinyl and film and probably, I don't know, retro video games and things are really hip, how many people among people is it that common?
Film photography? I sort of skew towards a weird group of friends and acquaintances as someone who's so deeply involved in the nerdery of photography. So most of my friends are camera nerds, and a lot of them shoot film. It's not their standard way of going, but a lot of them have a secondary or tertiary camera that they'll bring along and, bust out for special occasions or whatnot. So yeah, people are doing it. It's definitely popular, and it definitely seems like it's getting more popular as time goes on. Just more and more people are kind of reaching out to me like, Dan, I want to get a film camera. Where do I start? What should I get?
So where do you start? What should they get?
That's a great question. And I would point them to dpreview.com has been running a series of, just to backtrack a bit, since COVID lockdown started almost a year ago, and camera announcements and gear announcements kind of slowed down on the digital side, I decided to put some effort into producing some content about film photography to sort of nurture this need, and hired a couple freelancers to help write it. And one thing that's really exciting about film cameras, is this is in some ways the golden era, because they're so cheap and there's so many of them on eBay and there's so many of them on Craigslist. And if you want to get into film, the initial setup is very, very, the initial barrier is very low. It's once you actually want to get some film processed and developed that barrier starts ticking upward.
We'll put a link in the show notes. There's a couple of articles, The Absolute Beginner's Guide to Film Photography. And I think that's a good place to start. If someone were to ask me, I would say, if you really want to start with film photography, get a cheap Holga and do it that way because you're not spending a lot. You've only got 12 photos on a roll, so you'll be able to finish a roll. You were showing us a camera before we started recording. It's a half-frame camera. So on 35 millimeter film, a 36 exposure roll would give you 72, and you said you'd never finish a roll with 72 exposures.
Right.
And it's true that if you have 12, then you want the slowness of the film, but you want the immediacy of developing it within a few months after you've shot it. So you want to be able to finish that roll soon enough to get some pictures, to get a product, to get a proof that you've actually done something.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point to make for anyone just starting out, is to, whether you're shooting a medium format Holga in 12 exposures or, a 35 millimeter camera in 24, always go for the lower amount so it's how you learn. Unlike digital, there's no immediacy, so you want to be able to see what went wrong, what went right, 100%. But also, the fun factor of that too is you get a lot of happy accidents, especially with something like a Holga, where there's, you might have light leaks or who knows.
Yeah, the weird aberrations in the lens sometimes work out really interestingly. I mean, I don't want to keep talking about Michael Kenna, who's one of my favorite photographers, has been on the show twice, but he did a book of Holga photographs, I think 2 years ago, and it's really stunning to see what he got with that camera compared to his usual Hasselblad.
Yeah, absolutely. And another fun thing, it's, medium format offers so many possibilities, and, if you really want to get down to the technical, bits of it, if you're shooting a medium format film camera, you have way more sensor real estate than if you're shooting just about any digital camera on the market. Even Fuji's latest generation of medium format cameras, those sensors are not as big as a piece of medium format film.
And it's dozens of times the size of an iPhone sensor.
Exactly. So even the purists out there who want to get the absolute, best image quality, well, there's still something to be said for medium format. To some extent, I can hear our technical editor secretly yelling in my ear like, "You're wrong," but.
So the thing about the film process is, if you want to do the whole thing from start to finish, the slow film process, you shoot film, you develop your own film, you need an enlarger to make your own prints. That's a lot of work. I think for most people, shoot your film, send it off to get it developed. Get a contact sheet or get little prints and then send them out to get larger prints, because you're talking about needing a dark room, which the key there is dark, and making a dark room in your home is not simple. All the chemicals, all the equipment, it's very expensive to do that.
Well, it is and it isn't. I'll drop another link to a different article that we put together. If you're doing color, it's a little bit tricky, but black and white's actually pretty, you can get set up to develop rolls of black and white in your home for about $150, chemicals and gear all included. And then what a lot of people do now is they'll shoot black and white, and then they'll either scan it on a flatbed scanner, pull the files into, Adobe Camera, Photoshop, whatever, Affinity, and edit them like they would a digital file. Or they'll use a macro lens and a film holder with a translucent back, and they'll actually photograph it with a macro lens and, essentially digitizing those files. So for the most part, I think a lot of the people who are doing the DIY approach are skipping the whole printing method.
Most places that develop film, they'll give you scans along with your prints today, right?
They will, absolutely.
That's probably the best, because they're going to do the actual negative scan at a high resolution, convert it to positive, and send it to you, and that saves you the hassle.
Absolutely, and you'll almost certainly get a higher res scan than something you could get at home, simply because they're using, a drum scanner. And that is still one of the stumbling points with home digitization is, it's hard to get a really high res file.
Yeah. So going back one step, since I don't shoot film at all, I actually do have a film camera that's just some sort of consumer thing that I bought, and I bought some 24 exposure color film, and I think it's been years and that roll still hasn't been completed. Where does a person get this done? I mean, I'm assuming that because I live in Seattle, there are probably lots of different places where I could send my film out or drop it off or get it printed. But is there like one preferred place that you would have this done?
Well, Jeff, there's this thing called Google.
Google develops film?
A couple months ago, I was actually looking because I do have a Holga and another camera, and I Googled, and even in the UK, there are dozens of places that do it by mail.
Exactly. Yeah, that would be my recommendation for most folks. If you live near an urban core, there's almost certainly someone still doing film. Seattle alone, just to name drop, Panda Labs and Moon Photo or Moon Labs, they're the two go-to here's in the city that I would highly recommend anyone in the Pacific Northwest area. But yeah, most places, there's a lot of mail-in places. And actually the mail-in places tend to be a little bit more affordable, but they take a little bit more time.
Gotcha.
But you're looking at about $20 to get a roll processed, scans, and usually a contact sheet.
Okay. Well, because another thing, I noticed that in the news recently, Costco is getting rid of all of their photo departments. And I remember at one point, Costco was the place that you could drop off your film. I don't know if that's still been the case.
That was the 90s, right?
Yeah, that's actually, I think there's some chatter amongst, the film forum people people are pretty disappointed in that because they have always been a really reliable and affordable way to deal with film. But I guess, the profitability is not there.
Yeah.
So I've got a book here, and it was my snapshot pick pretty early on in the show. It's called Retro Cameras. It's a few hundred pages of photos of old cameras. And when I was looking at it today, I was thinking, why do we fetishize technology? Why do we get obsessed about these ancient artifacts like they're something from the Stone Age? And this is a rhetorical question, obviously, because I'm interested in technology enough that I look at these things. I mean, I bought this to be able to look at these pictures. But there's something about film cameras that, today you look at film cameras and you've basically got two kinds. One is a pocket computer with a tiny little lens and a sensor, and the other is the camera that looks like a 35 millimeter single lens reflex. And you had so many different types of cameras back in the day. And I'm not even just talking about those, Daguerre type cameras, but even in the mid 20th century, they had so many different shapes and sizes of cameras.
Yeah.
So Dan's holding up a little, what is it?
This is a Konica Big Mini. These are really popular with the street photography crowd because they're very small and quiet.
Yeah, and the other one you have, the Olympus, I used to have one of them, and I bought one recently. It's the
XA, yeah. These are classic, and this is actually a great camera that I would recommend to anyone interested in film photography. It's one of the tiniest rangefinder cameras ever made. Aperture priority only, super easy to use, really tiny, pretty sharp lens.
It has two settings for focus, right? Mm-hmm. Sort of medium and long distance. So you're not focusing with a proper lens. It's kind of like, so back in the day around, I have a son who was born in 1990, and around that time I bought a little compact film camera. And that was the kind that you had, that sort of all-in-one small lens. You don't have any focus. You don't have any settings, basically.
Yeah.
It was really a point and click.
Yeah. Yeah, those were really popular, especially in the 90s and the late 80s. Olympus and Pentax both made a ton of them. The Olympus Stylus Epic is actually the creme de la creme of pocket cameras. I bought one 5 years ago for $100. They now sell for about $400, meaning that if you had invested in 10,000 of those 5 years ago, you'd had a pretty good return on investment. But
that's almost better than Apple stock.
Exactly. But just to backtrack a bit about sort of that mechanical nature, there's something to be said, I think, again, in this sort of very digital technology age about, I'm holding up a Leica here, and not trying to be a snob or anything, but what's cool about a camera like this, and even a camera like this Nikon FM2, is these are both purely mechanical cameras. They don't need a battery. The battery is just the light meter. It's like a mechanical watch. And I think to that extent, that's why people get really excited about using them, because they're these really beautiful pieces of technology that were made to last well beyond what anyone probably even considered, or what people, I'm sure the guys this camera came on the Nikon FM2 in the late 60s, early 70s. I mean, I'm using a modern Nikon lens on it that I bought a couple years ago, and it works just fine. And I think there's something kind of cool to be said about that.
About the longevity of the technology.
Yeah.
We're used to getting a new iPhone every year, for example.
Totally, 100%.
Yeah. No, I agree. The problem is, of course, that when you get into cameras like that, they're a little bit more complicated. They're obviously more expensive. Which Leica do you have there?
So this is an M6. I also picked this up years ago when the Leica market wasn't so blown out, and I would probably not recommend most people you can get a really good camera just as good as a Leica for a tenth of the price.
Yeah.
I lucked out and bought this off actually an old Nat Geo photographer. I can't remember his name, but he was quite cranky, and I won't say any other details about him. This is going to get in trouble. But he was just clearing out a bunch of gear, and I got it for a bargain. It's probably one of my favorite things I own. But it's one of those things that when the moment feels real right, I'll take it out and I'll go shoot with it. And that's also, not just film cameras, digital cameras. There's something to be said about having a collection of cameras where, you can kind of pick the one that suits your mood to go take out and walk around with. That's kind of...
Yeah, but then you've got to have a roll of film in each one, and then you've got to finish the roll and develop it. Because if you leave them in too long, people need to be aware. The film's got to stay in the fridge. You can't leave it out in warm temperatures. So if the cameras are sitting around your house and it's summer, the film's going to go bad. But of course, like with the Holga, you might get some happy accidents.
Exactly. Yeah, totally.
So what about older cameras? Jeff has a couple of old cameras there, the kind with bellows.
Yeah, those predate my knowledge a little bit. But, the amount of resources about old cameras on the internet is pretty astounding. So I forget the website, and I wish I could name drop it, but there's a gentleman who's basically made it his mission to upload every user manual for every film camera ever made. And It's a great resource. You can donate to him, but they're all in PDF versions. And it's just people, there's a lot of people like that out there. So, yeah, Jeff, we should figure out exactly what you got there.
Yeah, so... All right, I'll take some pictures of these and put them in the show notes. But one of these is a number 2A Folding Pocket Brownie, and it's it's almost as wide as my iPad. It's pretty huge, but of course at the time
that looks like something from the 30s or the 40s.
At least.
Because the Brownie was later a sort of an all-in-one point-and-click camera. When I was young, I remember.
So I'm seeing this was introduced in 1910 for $7.
Wow. Yeah. So a friend of mine, she was clearing out some stuff. I think this camera and another one were owned by her father after he had passed away. And, talk about manual controls. I honestly don't even really know how to use this. I mean, the shutter release is just a little lever near the shutter. Not sure if I can, and there's a little guide here that sort of lets you estimate how far away the subject is in meters and feet. And I don't know, I've really only done digital photography aside from, having point and shoots when I was younger. And so I look at this and I honestly don't know how to use it.
Well, the thing about these cameras is there aren't a whole bunch of buttons and dials that you can set to do what you want. Your shutter is a little lever. For example, on that little Olympus, the shutter, do you have, Dan, yours, is it like a little orange or red shutter button?
Yeah, it is.
To make it stand out a little?
Yep.
And you don't have to press it hard. There's not much spring in it. Even when it was new, there wasn't much spring in it. So you really only have a couple of settings, if any. That little Olympus has two sort of focus settings, and I think it has an aperture setting. But most of those older cameras, if they don't have removable lenses, it's pretty much point and shoot. Now, with removable lenses, they're pretty much like today's lenses, focus and aperture.
Yeah, if you even get focus, a lot of them will be manual, but it kind of really depends. You take a brand like, Canon and Nikon, two of the bigger companies. If you take Canon, they switched their lens mount in the early 90s to EF. So Canon film cameras and Canon film lenses are very affordable. Nikon has been using F-mount since the very beginning. So F-mount lenses from the 50s and 60s and 70s and 80s still work on current Nikon F-mount SLRs. So they fetch a little bit more money on the used market. But if you already have a stash of Nikon glass, you can go pick up a Nikon film camera for $50 and start shooting film with your own lenses, which is kind of cool.
So I don't remember too well the days back shooting quote unquote street photography in New York City before it was called street photography. I'm trying to remember what is there special to remember. So I was using an Olympus OM10, and when you focus, you'd have those two little semicircles that would have to line up, and you'd have a light meter with a needle that you'd have to get set to the middle by adjusting the aperture. But that was it, right? There's no other settings on any of those cameras.
That's pretty much it, yeah. And, I think what's kind of fun even, like if I'm going out and shooting street photography on the 4 days of the year it's actually sunny in Seattle, I'll just pull the sunny 16 rule, set my aperture to f16, set my shutter speed to 1/4 length, and then just, basically jam my manual focus at infinity and just basically use my camera as a point and shoot. And I think that's a really fun way that a lot of people enjoy doing street photography with these film cameras, where you're shooting from the hip, you're not even looking through. It's kind of just a very, it really just comes down to that crucial moment when you think you may have something interesting. And I think that's a really fun method for people of doing street photography.
One of the problems, though, that comes related to the cost is that you might want to hesitate a little bit, because each time you press the shutter, that's costing a certain amount of money.
Totally.
And that's going to be another shot on your roll. And if you're at 32 and you've only got 4 more, sometimes you can get 37 out of a 36 exposure roll, but you tend to be a little bit more hesitant. And that's interesting if you're taking the time to compose a photo, but when you're doing something more spontaneous, I think you've either got to have a lot of money or just shoot until your roll's completed and then, not worry about shooting anymore.
Totally. Or if, you want to be thrifty, one of the fun things about film photography is you can always rewind the roll almost all the way, take it out and just run it through again and see what kind of double exposures you end up getting.
Well, it's important to note that while I said earlier it's an awful lot to set up to do your own printing and all that, it's relatively simple to develop your film. All you need is, what do you call the bags that you put your hands in to take the film out of the camera?
I think they're just like a dark bag.
Yeah, it's a dark bag. It's got 2 holes for hands. You put the camera in,
Yep.
You manipulate it, you put it into a little you roll it on a reel that goes in a drum, and then you just pour your chemicals in, set a timer, put some music on, make some coffee, and it's not that complicated a process. The chemicals smell a little bit, but it's not that hard to develop black and white film. Color, again, is different because you've
Totally.
got more complicated issues. But if you are going to do film and you really want to do it enough, you can save that initial money by developing your own film. Once you've got the negatives, you can do, let's say, basic scans and convert them to see how they look, and then you can send them off for prints.
100%, yeah, and that's a good point. I prefer color photography myself, but just the accessibility of black and white, it's something that I do a lot because it's also really fun to the process of pouring a bunch of chemicals in and then waiting and then pulling it out and seeing your images appear. There's something pretty, it's pretty hard to meet that excitement. It's like tuning into a child on Christmas. It's like that kind of feeling.
Well, my first experience with that was when I was in high school. Everyone had to do a shop class, and I didn't want to do the auto shop because it was all the jocks and all that, and I wasn't into wood shop, and they had a photo shop, 2 words. So I did that, and they lent us cameras, and we developed the negatives, we developed the prints and enlarged them and all that. And as you say, you expose the paper, you put it in the tray, you put the chemicals on, and you watch how it suddenly appears slowly. Yeah. And that's an interesting process. Similar to those of us who remember the SX70, the Polaroid, which was the kind of thing where you would, shoot the picture, it would come out, and you'd wait and you'd watch it. And I even remember my parents had one of those Polaroids, this goes way back, that the print would come out, it would be kind of curled, and there was this sort of pink stick with a chemical smell on it. I guess it had fixer in it that you'd have to run over the photo after it finished developing.
Oh, interesting. That doesn't sound particularly environmentally healthy to me.
No, I remember the smell. It was one of those sort of, bad chemical smells. It's probably, there's probably towns in the United States that have been closed off because of spills and that sort of stuff. But that was a process that was common back then. If you ever see really old photos with those sort of scalloped edges, that was done on that kind of Polaroid print camera. What about Polaroid? So Fujifilm has their Instax, which has been extremely popular, but the photos are really small. Is anyone coming out with a new kind of instant film, thinking again the Polaroid SX70, how popular it was in its day?
Yeah, so there's the two major players in the instant market right now. Obviously, one is Fujifilm, and the other is now, it's technically Polaroid, and I'm using air quotes as I say that because it's Impossible Project that has now bought the branding rights to use the Polaroid name. They make film that will work in old Polaroid cameras as well as their new generation of Polaroid cameras. Personally, I don't think the quality is that great, and I actually much prefer the Instax. Fujifilm does have an Instax wide and an Instax square format.
But they're still tiny.
Well, the wide's not that. The wide's a pretty decent size. It's only slightly smaller than an old school Polaroid, but it's still expensive. There's only 2 models that use the wide format currently from Fujifilm on the market. They're both very consumer oriented, which is fine. But for such a big format, it'd be really nice to see them come out with something a little bit more geared to actual photo enthusiasts.
Yeah, but aren't they like credit card size photos?
There are. In fact, yeah, I've got one of my dog right here. But the wide is about, it's basically like 2 of these together. That's how big it is.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, so it is a bit bigger.
So that's sort of SX70 size, although the SX70 was square.
Right, yeah. So it's still not going to be quite as big as the SX70, but it's closer. It's closer. So we'll see what the future has to hold. I do know that Instax is a cash cow for Fujifilm, and so hopefully we continue to see them develop out that line, which is interesting.
I think it's what's keeping Fuji alive, actually, isn't it?
At
least the camera division.
It really is. And, again, there's something to be said there. People's nostalgia for old instant cameras is what's keeping their entire digital fleet,
Well, but they did a big promotion with Taylor Swift, and that must have really exposed this to a whole lot of young people who wouldn't even think of old film cameras.
Yeah, totally. And that's, I see, just in the wild, not recently because of COVID, but, you go to like even a baseball game. I go see the Mariners here, and there's kids running around with Instax cameras in the stadiums. Like, children clearly really enjoy it. And I think it's the same thing. They were raised with iPads and stuff. So there's something to ooh and ah about something physical that they can actually hold and give to their friends if they want, or write something on the back,
One of the things that I would imagine appeals to people is just the ritualness of it. And, that can go back to even some vinyl music analogy, but also just that sense of, that sense of having more of a process to create something. Because now, with our digital cameras, we go and we shoot, and there's the whole process of making the photo, and then you just have the photo. But with film, you have all the other stuff, especially if you're going to develop it yourself. And I think, I don't know, like, is there just some sort of Zen attraction, or is it just because it makes things more hands-on and people want that hands-onness?
I think it's a combination of those two, really. I want to say I don't think it has anything to do with people wanting better image quality, because that's not what you'll get from film. But
yeah,
I think, that hands-onness is huge, and the process feels a little bit, it just feels like you have to think about it a little bit more. I think with digital photography, there's this push for perfection, to get things exactly right. No distortion, no, chromatic aberration, that kind of stuff. But with film, it's not that at all. It's more about capturing like a mood, a feeling,
Well, the thing about digital now is, let's put people in 2 baskets. The very big basket who used, pocket computers to take photos, and the much, much smaller basket of people like us who use proper cameras with lenses. For the majority of people, they just get what the camera, what the phone gives them. Apple's computational photography is extraordinary and does amazing things, particularly, HDR, et cetera. There is a built-in perfection to that. Yeah. And you're kind of locked into an image flavor, as it were. I guess in some ways film, I'm looking at this and saying, it's like vinyl. It makes noises, cracks and all that. And I appreciate noise in photos, the graininess of, film photography. Like, I have a bunch of prints on the wall here, and when I look at them, you can see the grain. It's palpable. But I think Well, there's a term in Japanese, wabi-sabi, which you've probably all heard of. It's like that there's beauty in, irregularity, like things that are chipped and broken. And I think people are starting to maybe accept that a little more.
Yeah.
On the one hand, they want the perfection. They're going to go out and spend the $1,000 or more for the iPhone because it's got the greatest camera. But on the other hand, there are a lot of people who are just want something that's more organic in certain ways.
That's exactly it. And I think, as we sort of push into this, quote, post-truth world, having something that is so honest and so straightforward, you're literally having a chemical reaction that happens on a piece of organic matter, and then you're going through the process to make the image appear. You can't, there's honesty and there's truth in that. And I think that that's something that people can kind of sink their teeth into.
Okay. Dan, we'll have links to DPReview and a bunch of the film articles that you've been publishing. We'll put a link to this book that I mentioned earlier, Retro Cameras, which really, if you're interested in the technology as such, it's really interesting because this covers, more than a century of cameras. I mean, it doesn't go back to the old view cameras where the guy puts his, the cloth over his head and all that, but it really shows the wide range of styles of cameras. So Dan, thanks very much for joining us, and take some great photos with your film cameras.
Yeah, I sure will. Thank you for having me.
Jeff, it's time for our snapshots. What have you got?
Something very timely, actually. I'm going to point to an article written by Malik, and it's called Why iPhone is Today's Kodak Brownie Camera. And it really touches on several of the things that we were talking about today, of how you had Brownie cameras, this brand that made photography accessible to so many more people. And that's basically what the iPhone is doing today. It's point and shoot. And there are people who are into photography who probably would not even say they were into photography, because it's just the thing that you do, right? Like, every single day, just go and take pictures, and it's made it easier for the masses. It's a bit of a historical look at photography, and then sort of bringing the iPhone into it. And it's just a really nice essay on how the two are similar.
Yeah, I read this, and I'm not really convinced that I agree with him, because the Brownie was still a relatively expensive camera for the time. I would say the closest similarity to the iPhone is when we had these disposable cameras that came out, 80s, 90s?
Yeah.
Because then at that point, you could just go to a 7-Eleven, buy a camera, shoot your film, drop it back off for development. The Brownie was still a little bit complicated. It wasn't something you could put in your pocket, whereas disposable cameras, that changed everything, I think.
Yeah, but compared to what you had to do before the Brownie, it was just much more involved. And so just the number of units that they sold really opened up the market.
It's true. But I mean, even in the 70s, Susan Sontag was writing about how cameras were everywhere, and we didn't yet have disposable cameras. What they did have is little point and shoot cameras. And it seems like every generation has its new cameras are everywhere.
They are. It's good. More photography everywhere. How about you this week? What's your snapshot?
I don't actually have an object as a snapshot. It's an idea. It just so happens that I've been writing an article about ergonomics today. For ergonomics, when you're working, your computer should be at the right height, your keyboard should be the right type, etc. Jeff's straining himself there, showing his RSI. And so one of the things I was pointing out in the article is that if you have a keyboard, you should not have one with a number pad, at least not if you're right-handed, because that means your mouse or your trackpad is further away and there's more arm movement. And what I was thinking of in relation to photography is when you're working on editing photos in whatever photo editing app, you're spending a lot of time with the mouse or the trackpad. In fact, unless you have one of those loop deck things, which I think you had for a while, where you've got little knobs that you can put in front of you, most people are generally sitting with the keyboard in front of them and the mouse or the trackpad on one side. So I was thinking, if you do a lot of work with photography, and for me, this is the kind of work you might be spending a lot of time, paying a lot of attention, squinting at the screen and stressing a lot. Think about the position of your mouse or trackpad. Maybe move the keyboard out of the way if you don't use it much, and put your mouse or trackpad in front of you. Now, obviously, for you and I, we write for a living, so we're using these devices a lot. And a lot of people listening may not use computers as much as we do. But it seems to me that any way that you can avoid getting that sort of repetitive stress injury would be a good thing to think about.
I actually had never considered that aspect of it. I mean, I've dealt with RSIs in the past, and it just so happens that the keyboard that I use most is an older Apple Bluetooth keyboard that does not have the extended keypad because, honestly, I never really used it. But you're right, like having just that little bit of extra travel to reach for a mouse or something would make a big difference. Good idea.
Okay, well, that's it for this week. Thanks for listening to Photoactive. You can find show notes, including any photos we discuss in this episode, at photoactive.co. That's photoactive.co. We couldn't afford the M. You can join our Facebook group at facebook.com/groups/photoactivecast. That's photoactivecast in one word. You can subscribe to Photoactive in your favorite podcast app or on Apple Podcasts. See the links on our website. And think about leaving us a rating or review in iTunes or in your podcast.